These concepts of thinking about how scientific approaches work and how they're different between different sciences, and how homeopathy, at least its inception, was quite different than how contemporary scientific research works, really brings us to what I think is a central debate in contemporary homeopathy. Two very different approaches to understanding what a medicine might do in clinic and how you'd apply it in clinic. And one is an inductive approach, and the other is a deductive approach. And again, so this is talking about the context within homeopathy, but it's a really critical and central debate, and very active debate, that's happening within the homeopathic profession over the last couple of decades in particular. And it's really been happening ever since homeopathy was invented, but we see it more and more recently. If we define what these two approaches are, inductive logic is that this is the principle of reaching a general conclusion by examining a small set of data, by reaching a conclusion by examining the particular and applying it to the general. For example, observing two trees with green leaves and then concluding that all the trees in the forest must have green leaves. So this is an approach where we start with the small information and build up to the big information. What we're looking at is small, specific, individual pieces of information. And you're looking at these components and then how we put them together in order to understand the whole. We're starting at the small and building up to the large. The opposite of this is deductive logic, and this is a process of reasoning in which a conclusion follows from stated premises. So reasoning is from the general to the specific, so starting at the large and working its way down to the small. So you start with a theory, that you don't actually have evidence for that theory as yet, but you say, well, I think this is a theory, this is a good idea, this makes sense to me. Now I'm going to work my way down to the small specific details and try to prove that my theory is true. And this is really an approach which is quite common in modern orthodox medical practice, scientific processes, where they say, I'm going to start with a theory, I'm going to start with a hypothesis, and then I'm going to work out from that, how do I test it? How do I break it down into small pieces and focus on these little bits in order to test or to prove that my hypothesis is true? This is quite the opposite of the inductive logic, which is what Hahnemann preferred, where you start with the small pieces, and then once you've got the small pieces, then you see the big picture on the basis of all the small pieces. So you're not starting with a hypothesis that you're trying to prove, you're starting with observation, and then you're collecting your observations. This is the empirical approach. If we look at what Hahnemann says about this as an example, this is from aphorism 10 from his Organon. He's again talking about the way that you should understand what a medicine is capable of doing. He says, the pure, peculiar powers of medicines for curative purposes are not to be discerned through specious a priori sophistry, so thinking about things beforehand or coming up with a theory before you see the facts, the smell, taste or appearance of the medicines, chemical processing of the medicines, or the use in diseases of one or several medicines in mixture. He says, one did not suspect that these histories of medicinal diseases would some day supply the first rudiments of the true, pure materia medica, which from the outset up until now consisted only in false conjectures and fabrications, and which was as good as non-existent. So we're seeing again here an example of Hahnemann's real passion. He was saying, we're not going to look at this stuff. We're not going to come up with a theory and then go and start testing the small specific details of it. We're not going to say, a doctrine of signatures approach maybe, and say because it smells like this or because it looks like this we could guess it might do this particular effect. It's not enough to look at the chemical processing of the medicines, and just because it's got these pieces in it, these pieces suggest what kind of effect it's going to have. He didn't want us to mix stuff together. What he wanted us to do is do the trial, he's proving, so it's human pathogenetic trials, and see what these things actually did in a healthy person, and base our use of them on this empirical or observation-based evidence that he got from this version of a trial. This is a really big obsession of Hahnemann's, you can see, and it's had a really strong influence on the way that homeopaths approach things, meaning that we're always starting with this approach to investigation rather than starting with a theory that we invent, ways to test and trial. We start with the information, and then based on the observation we then come up with applications directly from those observations. Again, this is a repetition, I know, but this is what aphorism 20 was talking about. This hidden spirit-like power in medicines, only discernible through investigation and not through intellectual exertion or through theorising or guessing about the way things could be. This is really, again, a big obsession in homeopathy, particularly with Hahnemann, but saying this is the way I want you to practice homeopathy, the way I want you to practice medicine. And a lot of this we need to be aware of. We often talk here, I've been talking to you about the difference between how this is in homeopathy, in the way that homeopathy was created, and comparing it to, say, orthodox medical practice or modern scientific medicine, we might call it. We need to also put this in a bit of historical context, because Hahnemann's obsession and the reason why he wanted us to practice this way was because what he didn't want was people practicing medicine the way it was taught in his time, which is not really related at all to the way medicine is practiced anymore. But he didn't want people doing bloodletting and purgings and fontanelles and cetons and all these unfounded and kind of bizarre and fairly barbaric practices that were happening in medicine at the era. This is him writing a book, his Organon, which was his idiot's guide to the practice of medicine, that he was printing and publishing and wanting doctors all around the world to start using, so that they could move away from these kind of barbaric methods that were happening in his era, and move towards an approach that was much more holistic, much safer, and based on this rational scientific approach to research that he invented in a trial, rather than based on humours and supposition and all these other things that had been happening. So you see, this is a really strong obsession of his, and you put it in the context of the medicine that was happening in his era, and you can really understand why he was so strong and so passionate about this, and wanting people to reject all these other ideas that he saw people using, and focus on something that he saw that was really well grounded and structured and researched and based on actual observable data, rather than based on suppositions and theories. So something really important for you to understand in the way the homeopaths work, because we're going to see the kind of the evolution of that idea in lessons ahead, and how this has developed and been implemented and evolved in contemporary homeopathic practice. So understanding how this idea initially came into homeopathy and the context of that for Hahnemann is really important in understanding the way that we now work in current homeopathy.